Here are 10 weird math facts that are cool to know, but also potentially useful in an exam. First, numbers can actually be irrational. And that doesn't mean they're hot-tempered or not making up their mind. It means that you can't express them as a fraction with one integer over another integer. That's the technical definition. There are certain numbers that you can't express as a fraction with two integers. For example, the square root of 2. It's actually 1.4 ... carrying on forever. It's not the fact that it carries on forever that makes it irrational, because a number like 1/3 carries on forever. That's 0.3333. It's the fact that root 2 can't be expressed as a fraction between two integers. As you can see, there are other irrational numbers. Pi is irrational. You can't express it as a fraction. It carries on forever. 1 over root 2 is also irrational. Sounds like a weird name, numbers being rational or irrational, but it could come up in the exam. That's weird fact number 1. Number 2, numbers can be real or imaginary. I bet you might not have known that. It's easier for me to define the imaginary numbers than it is for me to define the real numbers, because basically every single number is quote unquote real. So what are the imaginary numbers? Imaginary numbers are the square root of negative numbers. Obviously, that's square root of -1, square root of -2, square root of -3, etc. Everything else is real. You might have been taught that you can't square root a negative number. Technically, you can square root a negative number and you get I, the imaginary number. But you don't need to know that. You don't need to know about I. You don't even really need to know about imaginary numbers unless you're doing advanced mathematics or physics. But for now, you just need to know that all the other numbers are called real numbers, and it's only the square root of negatives that are called imaginary. And yes, this could also come up in an exam. Next, we have that 0 is neither positive nor negative. Some people think it's the first positive integer or the first negative integer. It's actually neither. It's in a special category. It's non-negative. I don't know if you've seen that word before, but non-negative means not negative. And 0 counts as being not negative, even though 0, as I've said, is not positive either. So if you ever see the phrase non-negative, that means 0 is included. But if you just see the phrase positive, then 0 doesn't count, because 0 is neither positive nor negative. And that is kind of weird. It's the only number for which that is true. Bonus fact though, 0 counts as an even number. I know it's not positive and I know it's not negative, but it does count as an even number. And negatives do too. For instance, -2, -4, -6, those are all negative even numbers. They count as being even. Of course, -1, -3, -5, etc. are odd numbers. So while 0 is neither positive nor negative, it is an even number. 0 counts as an even number. Next, did you know that numbers can be undefined? And that is a specific definition in mathematics, being defined or undefined. Let me simplify it for you. If we have a fraction and the denominator, the bottom line, is 0, then that number, that fraction, is undefined. If you try putting it into a calculator, it won't give a result. It might say NA or undefined or error. The calculator doesn't have an answer because any fraction with 0 in the denominator is undefined. But what follows from that is that anything else, i.e. there not being 0, there being a negative or a positive or whatever, is defined. So I have seen in an exam, in this case the GRE and GMAT, where a question will ask, for which of the following fractions is the result defined? And that just means, for which of the following fractions is the denominator not 0? Because remember, if the denominator of a fraction is 0, that fraction is undefined. If it's anything else, it's defined. Next weird fact. 0 is actually a multiple of every single number. So for example, if you're going to list off the multiples of 6, It starts with 0. It's actually 0, 6, 12, 18, etc. Most people start with 6, 12, but 0 counts as a multiple too. 0 counts as a multiple of 100, 0, 100, 200, etc. But I did want to warn you, most tests will usually specify positive multiple, because they also know that 0 is a multiple of every number. So if they ask you for the positive multiples of 15, then we would start 15, 30, 45, etc. But if they don't say positive, we can include 0, because 0 is a multiple of every single number. Now this is a fact not involving 0, as another weird fact for you here. Technically, negatives count as factors. For example, -2 and -3 are technically factors of 6. But I want to warn you, particularly for my GRE, GMAT students, they will almost always specify positive factors. They'll use that phrase, positive factors, because they don't want you to include -2, -3, -6, -1 as the factors of 6. But, and we have never seen an exam question where they have asked this, if they don't specify positive, if they just ask for factors, then technically you can include the negative factors of the number, but never fractions. A half is not a factor of 6. It has to be an integer. By the way, if you're liking these weird facts, please do leave me a like and a comment to let me know which weird fact you liked the best. But moving on, did you know that anything to the power of 0 equals 1? And that includes algebra, brackets, anything else. X to the power of 0 is 1. 1 to the power of 0 is 1. -4 in brackets to the power of 0 is 1. Anything to the power of 0 is 1. And 0 factorial equals 1. And that often does shock people, because people know that factorial is a measurement of how many ways you can arrange things. For example, how many ways can you arrange 5 people in a queue? It's 5 factorial, 5 exclamation mark. 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. If you don't know about factorials, by the way, I've done a video on it. But the question gets weird when you get to small numbers, right? 1 factorial is 1 as well, as I've written down below. There is only one way to arrange one person. But using that logic, it does kind of also make sense that 0 factorial is 1, rather than being 0, which is what you might expect. Because how many ways can you arrange 0 people? Oh, just one way. You can't arrange them at all. But if you philosophically disagree with that, do let me know in the comments, because you might say there are 0 ways of arranging 0 people, because you can't do any arrangements. Aside from that philosophical debate, mathematically 0 factorial is 1, and this could be relevant in permutations or combinations questions. So it's good to know. And finally, the 10th weird fact, I've got to confess, this wouldn't come up in the exam, obviously, but I wanted to throw it in there anyway. Pythagoras didn't actually invent Pythagoras. So if the topic of Pythagoras ever comes up in your class, you can be the smart aleck who actually says, you know what, Pythagoras didn't invent Pythagoras. There is a bit of a debate over who actually did it first. Was it an Indian mathematician or the Babylonians? But the best source that I could find stated that there is concrete evidence that the Pythagorean theorem was discovered and proven by Babylonian mathematicians 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. We're talking about the 2nd millennium BC. And I remember reading, but don't quote me on this, that the reason Pythagoras, that individual, that Greek individual, became associated with the theorem is not because he invented it, it's because he created a kind of cult, a numerological cult around the theorem. So actually, we're praising a cult leader when we call it the Pythagorean theorem. But of course, that's speculation. Either way, I hope you really enjoyed these 10 weird math facts. Let me know if you like this format. I know they were kind of fun, but they could actually come up in your exam. So they're actually pretty useful to know.